Today's episode, Natalie and I interview Fallon Morell, who's the author of Nourishing Traditions and president of the Weston A Price Foundation. Sally's work has centered around Weston A Price's research on indigenous people groups that he studied throughout the world. His findings were that good quality animal fat and protein provide numerous factors necessary for the full expression of our genetic potential and optimal health. And so, without further ado, here's our interview with Sally.
Hold up, one more thing. If you have not yet scheduled your 45-minute free exploration call to find out what the root cause of your symptoms are and your next steps to getting symptom free, you are going to want to pause this podcast and go do that right now. So I invite you to go to nutritionwithconfidence.com, book your free exploration call, and find out how to get your results.
A place that I was really interested in starting off was to hear a bit about Weston A Price. So I know a lot of your work, and you've started a foundation called the Weston A Price Foundation. Could you just share a bit about who Weston A Price was? And then I'd be curious to hear a bit about like how you stumbled upon his work in the first place.
Well, he was quite a person, really. He was one of the foremost dentists of his day. His practice was in Cleveland, Ohio, and he was really, at the time, known for his work on root canals.
Wow.
His only son died after a root canal that he'd put in, and his only child. So he then did some studies with rabbits showing that if you took a root canal infected teeth and put it under the skin of the rabbit would get sick in the same place that the human got sick. So he wrote this 1,000-page book about the dangers of root canals. But it was the work later in his life that we remember him for now, and that was his voyages to remote parts of the globe to study the dental health of isolated people, what he called primitive people, and then to see how that correlated with their diet. And he also took photographs, and when they're just memorable, you can't look at these photographs without being struck by what beautiful facial structure these people had. And also wonderful health, no cavities, but overall health and ease of childbirth. That was another thing that he and many others noted. And all that went away when they started eating Western foods. And it's two parts of it, and stopped eating the nutrient-dense foods of their ancestors. Most people only talk about the first part, the sugar and the white flour, because they don't want to talk about the second part, the animal fats, the organ meats, the blood that they ate, the fish eggs, all of these sacred foods. So I discovered his book in 1974. And I had one child at the time. I had three more subsequently, and raised my family on the principles that he outlines in his book. Very rich diet, lots of butter and eggs, and I was not going to pay any attention to these voices calling for what I call the puritanical diet out there, low fat, no butter, no meat, or very little meat, and which is really a kind of a death diet for a growing child.
Yeah. Do you know what was the impetus for Dr. Price in setting out to study all these groups? Was it related to his son dying?
I don't think so. He had a nephew who worked for the National Geographic, and anthropology was a really big subject in those days. And they were discovering the lifestyle and the habits and the beliefs of these people. And everyone who went to these isolated places came back with reports of what beautiful teeth these people had. And being a dentist, Dr. Price was intrigued by this. He certainly was not seeing this in his practice in Cleveland, Ohio. He was seeing rampant decay, infection, and dental deformities. And by that, he meant crowded and crooked teeth.
And what do you think is, like, in your eyes, his most important findings? Obviously, he was focused on dental health, but he talked about many other things that he saw. So what do you think?
The most important part of his research And the part that most people miss, it's really not elaborated until chapter 22 of his book. I recently heard a lecture where he extolled Dr. Price, but it was obvious he hadn't read the book because he didn't know anything about the foods. But that's in chapter 22, and this is what he calls the fat-soluble activators, which were 10 times higher in the traditional diet than the modern diet. And they are just the key to good health for everything in the body. These are vitamins A, D, and K2, and we only get them from the foods we're being told not to eat. So butter, organ meats, animal fats, lard, all these things that, make the dietitians clutch their hearts in pain. But he was very clear that there were certain sacred foods that were very high in these nutrients and considered especially important for having healthy children. So that's what we emphasize at the Weston A Price Foundation: fat-soluble activators, how to get them back in your diet, the farming methods that maximize these in the diet, and the importance of giving them to, eating these foods before conception, during pregnancy, during lactation, and during the growth of the child.
Right. And especially when you were talking about the specific types of fat soluble vitamins in those foods, like you have a big proponent of the Weston A Price Foundation is raw milk as a part of that. Do you want to go into that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, this gives the dietitians fits, of course, but modern pasteurized and especially ultra pasteurized milk is a poison, and it is for several reasons. One is the heat treatment, and the heat treatment for ultra pasteurized milk is 284 degrees. So boiling is 212, and it's 284 degrees, extremely hot. And studies have shown that the proteins are completely warped and distorted. In animals, they cause problems with the heart, the spleen, the blood, and they result in stupider animals. The animals can't do the mazes like they did before. So we're giving this type of milk to our children. Is it any wonder that the IQ is going down, all over the country? But also, what we've tried to show is that raw milk is, in fact, an inherently safe food. It has far fewer outbreaks and illnesses attributed to it than pasteurized milk. People don't realize that. The pasteurized milk outbreaks aren't publicized, but the the raw milk outbreaks, if it actually is an outbreak, are highly publicized. So, but the main thing is that raw milk is nature's food for the growth and development of all mammals. Every single vitamin and mineral in raw milk has a special enzyme to ensure 100% assimilation. And no other food is like that in the universe. So it's an especially good food for growing children whose digestive apparatus is not fully online until they're, probably teenagers. And especially today when the rest of the diet is so bad, if you give them raw milk, at least, and mom doesn't have to cook it or prepare it or anything, at least she can be assured that the growing child is getting the basics of what it needs. So we are huge proponents of raw milk. Consumption of raw milk is skyrocketing. The number of sources of raw milk has gone from about 20 in 1999 to over 3,000 today. Laws are being liberalized, and the farmers who are producing raw milk can't keep it selling out. They can't produce enough of it.
That's great. That's really great news. I love
it is.
for especially our children and like you're saying, for pregnancy too.
Yeah, it's very important for pregnancy to have the raw milk. And if anyone challenges on this, just come and study our babies. We've had thousands of babies born to parents following our diet, and they're just beautiful. They have broad, happy faces. They're easy children. They They don't cry. They're just a joy to have around.
Yeah. Yeah.
Will you share a bit about the origins of the concerns of raw milk?
Yeah.
My understanding is the concerns are certain bacteria like E. coli, etc., are more prevalent in raw milk, and Louis Pasteur, we saw
Yeah.
the
Well,
practice of pastures. Will you
yeah.
talk a little bit about that
Yeah.
history?
Well, Pasteur, who was not a very highly principled man, let's put it like this. But nevertheless, he never talked about pasteurizing milk. That idea came later after his death. And at that time, we had people crowding into the cities, and it was a huge problem. The death rate for children before the age of 5 was 50%. So if you were living in the tenement in the cities, you could expect to lose at least half your children.
Wow.
Now, at the cities at this time were absolute cesspools. There was no sewage, there was no water purification. The streets had piles of stinking horse manure. Remember, there are no cars. It's all horses and mules bringing everything into the city. And the health officials at the time said, "We can't let any more people into the cities. It's just a disaster." So these children were dying, and guess what they did? They blamed it on the milk. They called this the milk problem. And maybe it was partially the milk because the cows were in these inner city dairies. They were fed the swill from the whiskey production. The dairies were absolutely filthy. So, yeah, it could have been partially the milk, but it wasn't just the milk. So, mandatory pasteurization. So, they started to say, well, let's pasteurize this milk, let's heat the milk. And the first mandatory pasteurization laws were in New York in 1913. They may have also been in Chicago around that time. And but the milk problem had already subsided because they were cleaning up the water. The car had come along. Whatever you may think of the car, it's a lot cleaner than horses. And they cleaned up the city streets, and people were living better, and you had started to get refrigeration, and the death rate went down. And pasteurization always takes the credit for this, but there's no way scientifically you can say that this was due to pasteurization. Interestingly, the meeting, we have the minutes for the meeting of 1913 where they voted that all the milk in New York should be pasteurized. And they didn't do it for health reasons. In fact, they all recognized that raw milk was healthier, but they did it for convenience because they said it'll be much easier and much less expensive to inspect a few pasteurizing plants than to inspect all the dairies. So that's how it started. Yeah.
And so
And
typically milk then is, brought from hundreds, thousands of cows to these centers where they pasteurize so that it is easier for inspection at one
yeah,
spot.
yeah.
So
And when we started our farm and we went to the Department of Health at the University, at the state of Maryland, my husband and I went. We gave them this big presentation, and they were horrified. But the head of the department at the time, and I liked her very much. We were very friendly. She said, "Sally, we just don't have the budget to inspect all these little farms." That it was the same reason that they gave in New York in
interesting.
1913.
Wow.
So the laziness of the bureaucrat. So anyway, my personal belief on this is that any sale between two individuals, I think it's unconstitutional to regulate it in any way. That is interfering with your right to obtain what you need to eat and to live. Anytime there's a third party, that's when you want inspection. So
Yeah.
I don't think we need to inspect these little farms. Raw milk, even unregulated raw milk, some of it from not very sanitary establishments, has a very low rate of illness. And that's because raw milk contains these antimicrobial factors that kill bacteria, or they kill the bad bacteria. They don't kill the good bacteria.
Yeah. That actually leads me to the question of like, what is the goal? Because I know that there's now states that allow raw milk to be sold in grocery stores, and it's great. Like in Arizona, it's like that. In California, it's like that. But at the same time, there is that middleman situation with, and we lose
yeah, so
transparency.
that's if it's in
Yeah.
stores, there's a third party, and then you definitely want that to be regulated. But here on our farm, we sell in our farm store. There's no third party. I don't think it should be regulated.
Yeah.
Our cheese is sold to restaurants and things, and yeah, that should be regulated.
Yeah. I love the direct to farmer consumer kind of experience. It's much more enjoyable, and I think for everybody, you just create this different kind of culture in our society.
You absolutely do. And the farmer, he has a responsibility. He feels this responsibility. He knows these people. He doesn't want to make them sick. So, and we have the technology today to ensure clean raw milk. We have chilling, rapid chilling. We have on-farm testing. We have stainless steel. We have good soaps and disinfectants. I mean, there's just no reason to oppose raw milk for human consumption. And this is the future. It's not just a little niche thing anymore. This is the future. Raw milk will eclipse and take the place of pasteurized milk, I think, within 20 years. I don't think there'll be any more pasteurized milk in 20 years. And the agencies need to get used to this idea, because it's coming. It's not coming from the top. It's coming from the bottom, and the strong demand. And I think in the future, people will want to live near the farms producing their food, especially their milk. So I think we'll see a very different type of pattern that mixes rural and the town and the country.
That's awesome. That's really good to hear. I'm so happy about that.
Yeah, that sounds good to me. And I wanted to kind of maybe shift towards talking about fats, right? So I grew up, it seems like since the 70s, there's been this discourse that fats, saturated fats, cholesterol, increase one's susceptibility to heart disease, obesity, diabetes. I mean, this is what I grew up with. I think a lot of us grew up with. And then in my anecdotal experience doing the GAPS diet, doing the ketogenic diet, I have felt amazing. So here I am, feeling good. I enjoy eating fats, right? Who doesn't? Healthy
And you
fats,
haven't dropped
butter.
dead yet, right?
I haven't dropped dead yet. Yeah. So I would
Yeah,
love
well,
to.
this whole idea was the invention. It was a marketing campaign. It's actually been going on for 110 years, since
Oh, wow.
1913, by the vegetable oil industry, starting with Procter and Gamble, to demonize the competition and to make people think it's vulgar to cook in lard, and it's wasteful or elitist to use butter. I feel very grateful, because my mother, she was kind of snooty, and she was not going to use margarine, because it wasn't the best kind of people who used margarine. She was going to use butter, and no one could dissuade her. But she did use Crisco for the pie crusts, because they really emphasize that, it's country hicks that use lard, and their houses smell like pigs, and their kids are ruffians. So we had Crisco in the pie crust. But fortunately, we grew up with butter. But I just can't stress enough that there's this idea that saturated fats and cholesterol are bad for you. It's not supported by the science. It never was supported by the science. It's completely made up. And one thing you need to realize, they say, oh, this hard saturated fat, if you put it down your sink, it'll clog your sink. Okay, and it sure will. But your sink is about 50 to 70 degrees. Your bodies are 98 degrees. That's a very hot day. And saturated fats are not hard at that temperature. They're liquid. And they're, fluid, but they're also stable and provide structure to your cells. It's just what warm-blooded animals and humans need for their cells. If you were a fish, a cold-blooded fish, then you'd want a lot of omega-3, because That's kind of like antifreeze. But our bodies are tropical, and that's why plants in the tropics have a lot of saturated fat, because it gives stability to their leaves. So coconut, palm oil, palm fruit oil, palm kernel oil, they're mostly saturated, and it has to do with the temperature.
That's awesome. I haven't heard that connection with the plant tropic or the tropical plants.
Yeah. And what if somebody said to you, oh, well, let's see, you make testosterone out of cholesterol, or you make estrogen out of cholesterol. Mm-hmm. Would you take a cholesterol lowering pill if you knew this? Yeah. So it's just because we're not told the truth, or information is withheld, that people have fallen for this. On the other end, there's this huge pressure on the doctors to prescribe the cholesterol lowering drugs. Even with the increase in studies showing that they're worthless and counterproductive. Recent studies showed that there's more blockage in the arteries of people taking statins than not taking statins. So, but they want to give these drugs to children. They want to give them to young adults. Yeah, okay. If you don't care about having any testosterone production or estrogen production, well, be my guest. But they're not telling people this.
Yeah. And how important is it for especially a child or baby to have cholesterol, right? Like,
yeah,
there's a huge need, right? Tell us about it.
Yeah. So babies really do need cholesterol, but they can't make cholesterol. So they need it in their food. And mother's milk is very rich in cholesterol and has special enzymes to ensure that 100% of that cholesterol is absorbed by the baby. The baby needs the cholesterol to make hormones, and babies make testosterone and estrogen just like grown-ups do. They need it for gut health. They need it for the development of their brain. The brain is growing at a rapid pace, so they need cholesterol for all this, and the scientists know it. If you buy milk replacement for calves, the third ingredient is animal fat, because they know the calves will not grow without animal fat. If you buy formula for human babies, there's no cholesterol, no animal fat in that formula. They're based on processed milk proteins, vegetable oils, and sugar. They're the ultimate junk food. And we think it's okay to give this to babies.
Right. I love that you've been a part of making like the homemade formula, breast milk replacements from real food, right?
Yes,
and I love your recipe.
Milk. Yeah.
Yes. Tell us about the different ones that you
yeah.
can do. What options are there?
I look back on my own life, and a lot of my own health problems I've been able to really got me into this field. And I have 4 children. My oldest, I was able to breastfeed, and I was a breastfeeding Nazi. Believe me, everyone had to breastfeed, and I succeeded because I was feeding her all the time, like 12 hours a day or something. And she got very tired of it about age 8 months. So there's nothing left there. So then my son was born and started out breastfeeding, and he was starving. I did not have enough milk for him, and he was starving, and I was frantic, just absolutely frantic. And he's screaming, crying all the time. So I had of course I didn't want to give him formula. I knew how bad it was. So I had an old book called Nutrition for Tots to Teens, and it had a formula for recipe for formula based on raw milk, and you added some vitamin C and a few other things. Well, I found the raw milk and added the vitamin C and gave him a bottle of this, and he gulped it down, and problem solved. Absolutely problem solved. He was very happy. And there is this little device that you can breastfeed and give the bottle and give the formula at the same time, which I did for a few months. So, and then in my other 2 boys, same thing. I mean, by the last one, there was just nothing to feed him with. So he was a week old when I started the formula with him. Anyway, they all grew up beautifully, very smart, very healthy. And so when we were writing Nourishing Traditions, Mary Enig and I said, what do you think, Mary, of having a recipe for formula? And I said, I used just raw milk for my babies. And she thought that was a wonderful idea. So she actually developed the recipe, which has a lot of things added that make it closer to human milk, like extra whey. And we add the vitamin C, we add cod liver oil. And we also did a milk-free formula based on liver. She said Gerber used to have a meat-based formula. But then the soy came along, which is probably the worst thing in the world you can give to a baby. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so we put that in the book, and a company, Radiant Life, sold all the ingredients, as a package. So, and you kind of we let that go into the universe and see what happens. And people started using this formula. And we got wonderful feedback on it. The mothers were so happy. And we reckon that about 20,000 minimum babies have grown up on this formula. And none of these babies has gotten foodborne illness. We've had a few problems with digestion. Some of these babies are very fragile to begin with, but none of them have gotten E. coli or foodborne illness. So, and meanwhile, commercial formula can be very dangerous. It's killed a lot of babies. So yeah, that's been I think the best thing about the work I do is hearing from these moms. And they're so grateful. People just have no idea what it's like to see their child starving. And this formula has been a godsend for many, many moms.
I believe it. I'm a nutritionist, and I've helped some of my clients with directing them to your recipes. And I did get a question about the liver recipe with the meat-based formula for dairy-free. Do you get concerned about too much vitamin A, and like how long should like a baby be on the meat-based formula?
Well, I'll tell you a story. I was at a conference, and a very nice older man sat down next to me, and he kind of slapped this photograph down on the table. And he said, "This is for you, Sally. This is my granddaughter." And she was just gorgeous, beautiful child, beautiful rosy cheeks. And he said, I don't know why the mom was not breastfeeding. He said, this baby could not keep anything down, nothing with any trace of dairy in it, milk. Okay. And he said, we were desperate. The child was starving, was going to die. And we thought, well, we only have one thing left we can do. Let's make the liver formula. So they made the liver formula and put it in the bottle and gave it to her. She drank the whole bottle, didn't throw up. She'd been projectile vomiting every other bottle they'd given her. And so they kept her on it, for a year or so. And it saved her life. And he said that the second daughter, born to the same mother, they didn't even try anything else. They just gave the liver formula. So then it seems to be fine. Yeah.
Awesome.
And so it's liver and what else in the
It's
formula?
liver and broth, bone broth, and it's coconut oil. That's very important. That's the only saturated fat in there. So coconut oil, and I think there's vitamin C. There's a few other things. Yeah. We do in both recipes, we add a little bit of sunflower oil, cold pressed, because surprisingly, mother's milk is rather high in omega-6, about 5 or 6%. And Mary was insistent on this. She said, you need that omega-6 for growth. So we put it in both formulas.
Yeah. Do you, I'm sure we could go into the details or weeds about this, but what about so it has to be specifically sunflower oil and cold pressed, of course, but
yeah, it could be something else. Yes.
Like a sesame oil, maybe?
Yes,
or
it could be sesame, but sesame oil can be allergenic.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think sunflower oil is fine.
Yeah. And so you're not concerned with like long-term eating, like a baby eating this for like months?
Well, we are very concerned about exclusive breastfeeding after 6 months. And we've made that very clear. Now, this wouldn't happen with the liver formula, but with the milk-based formulas, the baby's not getting enough iron and needs more iron from 4 to 6 months. And no traditional cultures did exclusive breastfeeding after 6 months because babies get anemic, and that's very serious in a baby. So we're not saying to give these formulas for years and years. We're saying you start your weaning foods, which are egg yolks and pureed liver, and gradually add other foods. And then by the time they're a year, they can just have regular milk, regular raw milk. They don't have to have the formula.
Yeah. It's such a great way to I get the most nutrient dense ingredients into a child. Like I love the whole concept of those first foods being really high fats, really high, the
high
superfood.
cholesterol, high
Yes.
cholesterol. So egg yolks and liver, you can't get any foods that are higher in fat or cholesterol or nutrients in those foods. And those should be baby's first foods. And you can make a lot of mistakes if you just follow those few things because they're getting what they need.
That's awesome.
Sally, could you say more about your concerns with soy and some of these other ingredients that are in conventional formulas? What sort of effects are they having on these babies' bodies?
Well, soy is a disaster. It's an absolute disaster. It's very difficult to digest. I mean, it causes all kinds of problems in the gut. It is a goitrogen. It depresses thyroid function. And it is an endocrine disruptor because it's very, very high in estrogen. A baby on soy formula has 13,000 to 22,000 times more estrogen than a baby on milk-based formula or milk or mother's milk. And this has an effect, especially on little boys. Little boys have testosterone levels the equivalent of an adult male until they're about 6 months old. And this programs them to express male characteristics at puberty. And that is overridden when you're giving all this estrogen to the boy. My experience hearing from parents is that these children have a lot of trouble in school. They don't learn easily. They have a lot of trouble completing tasks, following through on things. They tend to be somewhat autistic. They have gut problems, terrible gut problems. They gain weight because they have low thyroid function. It's a terrible way to start out a child, and it never, ever should have happened. It was developed by the Seventh-day Adventists, and it's been imposed on their kind of religious views on food have been imposed on the whole population.
Interesting.
That's so sad.
Now, the use of soy formula has gone way down, thank God. And I've heard soy executives complain about this. Oh, our soy formula used to be 25% of all babies, and that's gone way, way down from then. So
that's good.
When you were talking about the goitrogenic effects, and is there a real big need for iodine in, especially with children and my understanding with like pregnancy, it's very important, right?
Yes, well, yeah. So you need to eat seafood. I know that there's mercury in seafood, but there's always been mercury in seafood. And if you have good gut flora, you don't absorb the mercury. But yes, you need to have some good sources of iodine in your diet. One of the best is butter, if the butter comes from cows near the ocean. So New Zealand butter would be good. Irish butter is good. And see, this is the kind of thing our Department of Agriculture should be doing. What are the best places in America for producing the healthiest butter? And ironically, some of the best places are very close to where I live on the eastern shore of Maryland in the marshes. And they tell people, oh, you can't have cows in the marshes because these are wetlands, but it's not illegal. I mean, they tried to tell us this and we fought them off. We couldn't graze in our wetlands. But, there's some really beneficial things we could be doing to help our children. But none of our agricultural policy is aimed at helping children. We profess to be a nation that loves children, but that's not inherent or obvious in what we do.
Right. Absolutely.
You talked about, you know, young children are given skim milk. I'm thinking of other things like that I ate growing up, breakfast cereals,
Cereals, yeah.
the crisps, the sugary foods,
Pop
that are
Tarts,
Pop
remember?
Tarts,
Pop-Tarts.
yeah,
Yeah.
gummies.
Soda.
Could
Sodas,
you,
yeah.
yeah, speak more to the problems? I mean, it seems obvious probably to most people, right? We see diabetes rates
Skyrocketing.
skyrocketing,
Obesity, yeah.
obesity happening to younger and younger children. Could you just like talk more about
Cancer, by the
mechanism?
way, number one
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
children.
yeah, like
Well, it's
mechanism.
what you
Yeah.
would expect. A lot of people have predicted this. Mary predicted this. I predicted this. Uh, we're in the 11th hour. Uh, at least 50% of our children have some serious health problem. And, Pottinger showed in the cats, when you get on the fourth generation of eating processed food, there's no more reproduction. And that's where we are now. There's less and less reproduction, less and less even interest in sex, right? At least sex with the opposite sex. And I call this the natural selection of the wise. The Bible talks about a remnant. Uh, People are not going to be wiped out by war or cataclysm. They're going to be wiped out by putting harmful things in their body temples. And I blame the churches for this also. Some of the worst food you see is at the coffee hour after church. There just seems to be no recognition of how magnificent these bodies that we have are and how they need to be cared for. So, but the people who do recognize this, there's a remnant that does recognize this and has taken steps to feed their children right, and that's who's going to be left. I call this the natural selection of the wise. And the food industries end up believing their own propaganda, and their children are just as sick as everybody else's children.
Mhm.
Yeah, and you've talked about how you are a huge proponent of raw milk, raw dairy products. What are some of these other foods that especially a young person should be focused on? If parents could do, I don't know, maybe
Yeah.
incorporate like 5 or 10 foods, like what are these foods that are most nourishing
Well,
for
number
children's
one would be
bodies?
butter. Get your fats right. And there's just no place for spreads, margarines, and vegetable oils in the human diet. They're not food and they don't nourish the body and they're very harmful. And number two would be minimize sugar. I'm not saying that you have to completely eliminate it. I think that's kind of difficult for most families, but minimize it. Don't give a kid a candy bar when you can give them a piece of cheese. So let's see. And liver. Okay, so liver is the most nutrient dense food on the planet, and it's very hard for most people to eat. And I think we need to develop ways of, as I say, making awful taste good.
Mm.
And it's very easy to do in Europe because you can get liver sausage. You go to a pub in England, every pub serves chicken liver pate. I love eating in Europe because I can always get those things.
Yes.
We need to develop that here, and I'm hopeful we can actually do some things like this on our farm. But we need to do these, like Bill Schindler, who's close to us on the Eastern Shore. He's developed a hot dog with liver in it. Just think, if every hot dog had liver in it, how much healthier our children would be. So instead, they liver, most of these organ meats, and especially liver, it just goes to pet food. So there's the pet food people want cheap ingredients to make the pets healthy. And so there's pressure not to give these foods to people, just like there's pressure not to have whole milk for the children, because the industry would much rather you had skim milk all day, and then in the evening you're craving fats and you go eat a half gallon of ice cream, because they make at least 5 times more on the butter fat if they put it in ice cream than if they leave it in the milk for children, growing children. Why should we do that? Basically, our food decisions of how to feed our children are being made by accountants. And I have a problem with that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I love the work of, especially parents getting into the school systems and things like that to make sure that there's at least some remnants of like still really good
Well,
animal foods.
I sort of have to disagree there. The school lunches are beyond repair. They're absolutely beyond repair. It's the skim milk with sugar in it, almost as much sugar as a soda, that they have to put on every desk. The kids can throw it away, but they're obligated by law to put one of these on give it to every child at the lunch hour. And the rest of the lunch is total garbage. And you're not going to fix these lunches by making the schools buy organic food or anything like that. It's just, they're completely beyond repair. These lunches are cast in concrete by the mighty men of the earth, as it says in Revelations, and their sorceries. So I think your efforts are better spent convincing parents to make your children's lunches. Right. Because you're not going to repair the school lunches.
Yeah. So it has to come from inside the home and the family culture.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And empowering families one by one with this
and
information.
then in the schools they sell sodas and snacks. Why? Because they get money for it. Again, it's all being decisions made by accountants.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, do you think most people are averse to liver because they just didn't grow up with it? I mean, I found, because when I learned that liver was healthy, like most things, when I learn they're healthy, I just go for it. So I'm eating the raw liver, right? At first I was like, I don't know if I can keep doing this, but over time I've noticed I've come accustomed to the taste of it, and now I'll eat a bit of raw liver every day. It doesn't bother me so much. Do you think it's just because I grew up not eat? Because I know it's
possibly.
yeah.
I had never eaten liver in my life. We got butter, but we didn't get liver. I think my mother just didn't want to deal with getting us to eat liver. But I discovered liver when I was living in France, going to school there, and people talk about French cuisine, but there's no cuisine that's worse than French institutional food. It's just so awful. So I would sneak out to the cafe, and they had something on the menu called terrine. Oh, well, that sounds interesting. I thought it was soup,
Okay.
and it was like this. It was like this slice of cold meatloaf. It's served with bread, and of course, it had liver in it. And I took a bite of that, and it's just like my whole body lit up. And so I just started going to the cafe and eating terrine. And then I learned about pate, and then I had a bite of foie gras, which is the livers of fatted animals, of ducks and geese. And that was just like eating a piece of heaven. It just tasted so good to me. So ever since then, I've sought out liver done this way. But you could go to open market and buy all of that, all ready made. The French women aren't doing this in their kitchens. They don't have very big kitchens, but they could buy it. And you can still buy this stuff in Europe if you know what's good for you. So that's the kind of culture we need to encourage in America, as I say, making offal taste good. Yeah. So everyone will eat it, or hiding it. I hid it in the kids' foods. My son called me up one day and he was making spaghetti sauce from Nourishing Traditions. And he said, "Mom, there's chicken liver in this spaghetti sauce." He said, "Did you put chicken liver in our spaghetti sauce when we were growing up?" And I said, "I sure did." Never knew. You never knew.
That's awesome. Do you, one thing I found difficult is trying to find like blood sausage here in the States. And do you have good like tips on that and how
I'm so glad you brought up blood sausage, because Apparently there's only, well, first of all, blood it's even more nutrient dense than liver. And it's used in all cultures that have animals, African, Asian, European, they use the blood. And that's something else that we need to get back to. Apparently there's only one place in America that makes real blood sausage, and he was grandfathered in when they came up with all the rules, and this little farm is still going. So yeah, we need to get real blood sausage back into our diets, and it's delicious. It's absolutely delicious.
Yeah. Do you have the resource of that farm? Are they just tapped out?
I don't have the resources at the time to do blood sausage. I did make it. You can order blood.
Yeah.
And there's a recipe in my book, Nourishing Fats, I think.
Okay.
And I made it, it didn't look like sausage, but I made it in a tureen. It was very good. You make it with oats, pork fat. So you have to have, it's not rendered fat, it's chopped up pieces of pork fat and the blood and spices. So
I'll have to check that out.
Yeah.
I'm totally going to check that out. Thank you. I'm glad that's recipes in
But
there.
you can order, there's some Filipino food company that sells frozen blood. Now, not going to be the best quality animals, but you can get it. You can get it.
I'm a fan of Mary Reddick, and she was a mentor of mine over the last couple of years, and she's talked a lot about how blood was the first time she drank blood, fresh blood. It was like everything was right in the world, and we
have a great photograph. Hilda Gore went to Africa to the Maasai, and we have this great photograph of a Maasai elder holding a big bowl full of blood, and he drank the whole thing.
Amazing.
Wow.
Yeah. Amazing.
So tracking back to Dr. Price, and I'm hearing, animal products were central, the organs were prized, fish, what
fish eggs,
fish eggs. Yeah. And what observations did he have of these groups around vegetables, around grains? Were these foods in their diet much?
Yeah, they were in some diets. In the temperate regions, they had grains. So the Swiss and the Gaelic people had grains. The Australian people had grains that he visited. And now Dr. Price really didn't explore this, but we now know that they were always prepared with great care, soaking or fermenting to pre-digest them. And this is why so many people have gotten sick from grains. There was a big push for whole grains in the 70s. I lived through that. Diet for a Small Planet was a good idea. And all of a sudden, people had, digestive problems and gluten intolerance and irritable bowel syndrome. And that's because those grains are very hard for us to digest, and we have to prepare them properly. But and then in the South Pacific, they had a lot of high carb foods, sweet potatoes, taro, that kind of thing. And usually those were fermented, but they did have these high carb foods and vegetables. Some cultures had vegetables. South Seas people did, but they were kind of like a luxury or a treat. I mean, in Switzerland, they had a few vegetables in the summer months. They didn't have freezing, and they didn't have refrigerators. Now, things like cabbage were fermented to keep them all year. So yeah, they did have vegetables. What's interesting is the amount of vitamin C we're getting in our diets is about 10 times greater than it was in 1900. Because we do have vegetables, we have fruit. We can go into any supermarket and buy all these things. Another thing we have that we just take for granted is salt. And traditional cultures had to, go to a lot of effort to get salt. And that's one way in which we have a tremendous advantage over the traditional people, because we have salt and it's inexpensive. So nobody's suffering from salt deprivation in the modern world.
I have just another curious question. I've been thinking a lot about like salami and Italian culture and that kind of preserving. Can you preserve salami
Well,
without sugar?
salami, yeah,
Or yeah,
it doesn't, a good artisan salami doesn't have sugar in it. It's a
yeah,
lacto fermented food.
yeah.
And I did not have pork products in Nourishing Traditions for two reasons. One is that my co-author was Jewish and she kept a kosher kitchen. I didn't want to,
Mm.
insult her in any way. But secondly, I had heard that if you eat pork, it causes undesirable changes in the blood. So some years later, we did these really interesting studies on pork where Beverly Rubik did this for us. She's really good at doing, the blood analysis. And sure enough, if somebody just ate a pork chop, they would get rouleau in their blood for several hours. So it's a kind of shock to the system. But if the pork chop had been marinated in vinegar or lemon juice or something and then cooked, no rouleau. So, and we tested prosciutto ham, we tested bacon, a few other products like that, and no rouleau. So there was our answer. Pork needs a very special type of preparation of curing. And so after that, a whole new food group became open to me and to everybody. And that was the artisan charcuterie, which is fine, great for children. You know, my grandsons get their salami sandwich every day, but we buy the best without the additives. So this is another wonderful food that we can include.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And I love it because of the high thiamine content in the
Yes,
pork.
pork
Yeah,
is very rich in B vitamins. Yeah.
yeah, it's awesome. It's good.
Sally, I wanted to ask, you've mentioned a number of times your colleague and co-author, Dr. Mary Enig, and I know she's no longer with us, and I'm curious to hear like in what ways she really influenced you and touched you, and how you keep her with you in any ways, if you'd be open to sharing.
You know, it's interesting. I really have felt close to her recently. I wrote an article, was called The Forgotten Research of Professor Clement Ip. I thought that was such a funny name, Clement Ip. But Mary, I remember Mary talking about this research. And it wasn't just him, it was several researchers back in the 1980s, 1990s. And so these names all came back to me that she had mentioned. And basically, what they found was they tried to they injected the mammary glands of mice with either strong carcinogens or cancer cells. And then they gave the mice different diets. It was the same diet, but with different types of fats. And if they gave polyunsaturated fats to the mice, the cancers grew and metastasized and killed them. If they gave saturated fat to the mice, the cancers didn't grow. But if they gave CLA to the mice, and this is a special fat that's in the fat of grass-fed animals, if they gave CLA to the mice, the cancer shrunk. Now, how many people getting treated for cancer today are told this? And this research has been around for 50 years, or 40 years anyway, 40 years. Very well done, repeatable. Anyway, it's that kind of thing that make me remember Mary. She was also very concerned about MSG in the food. She knew it was a terrible toxin. She was very concerned about the low salt business because she knew how important it was. And one of the things she showed me was it's just 2 or 3 so-called researchers who were doing the work on salt, saying we needed to cut back on salt, and they just quoted each other, round and round and round. Yeah. So she was very interested in fermented foods because they gave a lot of B vitamins. Yeah, and she supported raw milk. I didn't think she would, but she supported raw milk. So, yeah, we really owe a lot to Mary. And I was privileged to be able to give her a voice because she'd been totally ostracized by the establishment.
That's touching. Beautiful.
Well, Sally, we're getting about to the end of the interview here, and if um, your your words here have been resonating with our listeners, and they wanted to learn more about your work, the Weston A Price Foundation, where's a good place to direct them?
Oh, okay. So I have a blog. I don't post very often, not as often as I'd like to, but it's nourishingtraditions.com. And you can leave comments and things. Weston A. Price is westonaprice.org. And it's a huge website. Everything we've ever published in our journal is on that website. It's completely free. We don't have any paywall for that. And then the third website is realmilk.com. And that's where you can go and put your state and zip code in, or just your state in, and find the raw milk near you in whatever
Perfect.
form, whether it's in a store or, um, from the farm or pet milk or whatever.
Yeah.
So those are the three websites.
Great. And we'll link all that in the show notes. And I'll speak from experience. I've been to all the websites. I've received a lot of value from them. We've also been we were part of the Boulder chapter, and we actually led the Boulder chapter for a period of time. And
Oh,
if
good.
you've got a Weston A Price Foundation chapter around you,
Yeah,
highly
they're great
recommend
resources.
plugging in. Yeah, it's such a great resource to develop community around you,
Yes.
and then also to connect with local farmers. And so it's
Yeah,
a
each
really great.
chapter has to keep a food resource list of what's available in their area. And most of the calls they get are for raw milk. Not every source of raw milk is listed on our realmilk.com.
Great. Well,
Yeah, we love.
Sally, oh yeah.
Oh, we just loved our time with you. Thank you so much again.
Oh, thank you
Been
for
great.
having me and for all you're doing. And, send us the link and we'll post it for you.
Awesome.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thanks so much, Sally.